Hi, I'm Val from Quilty Pleasures, and today I want to talk about thread management and a couple of products that are really helpful, but nobody seems to know about them. So the first one is Sewer's Aide. It's a thread conditioner. It's a silicone-based liquid, and it just, if you've ever had trouble with thread shredding or snapping, or you just kind of pulling apart while you're sewing on your machine, often it's because of the heat that's caused by the friction of the speed of your machine and subjecting the thread to that kind of wear and tear. Sewer's Aide cools that thread down, and so it's very easy to use. All you do is you run a little bead of the Sewer's Aide along the length of your thread. You can see it quite clearly. As it goes through the machine, of course, that thread is going to be used up, and it's going to distribute the Sewer's Aide inside your machine as you're sewing. It doesn't gum up your tension discs, it doesn't mess up your needle, it has no effect on your stitch quality or how your machine works or anything. All it does is condition the thread so that it goes through more smoothly, and it stays cooler so that it isn't subject to heat. When you don't see that bead of Sewer's Aide anymore, just reapply another one and you're good to go. You can also use it for hand sewing, but I have another product to show you for that too. So, okay, the next product I want to talk about is Fray Check. I use it all the time for several types of sewing that I like to do. I like to do a lot of applique by machine, and I use the Fray Check to seal where I stop and start my stitching on my appliques. Just gives it a little bit of extra security. Even though I've done a tie off or a knot or whatever, it just gives me extra insurance. I also like to use it when I'm quilting. So if I'm starting in the middle of a project, sometimes I'm lazy and I don't always tie my threads in, especially on wall hangings, things like that aren't going to be subjected to a lot of wear, but they will occasionally be washed or handled or whatever. I want to secure my thread ends so that they don't come undone. I also sometimes make mistakes, and I end up with little boo-boos that I have to fix, and Fray Check gets me out of a lot of pickles. So I'm going to show you how that works. I like to do a lot of crazy quilting. I've been doing it for years, and it's just a great way to use up scraps and get rid of some odds and sods, and it's a great thing to do when you're at a retreat or sewing with friends and you don't want to miss any of the gossip, but you don't want to have to think too hard, so it's a good thing for that. But sometimes when you're not paying attention, little things happen, and I just want to show an example here, full disclosure, because you know, here's a little spot right here where I didn't quite catch that seam in there. See, I'm just lifting it up a bit. And that is the kind of situation where put the Fray Check on it and it seals those edges. So what I would do, I've already done this has been done years ago, but you just put it on there. Whoops, I lost my tip. Okay, so that is going to seal those edges up so they don't fray even if it's washed. And I know it's wet now, but when it dries, it's going to be fairly soft. I did this, can you see that? There. This as a sample. I actually cut there? Yeah. Cut my fabric and put some Fray Check on about, I don't know, 15 minutes ago. As you can see, it dries clearly. It kind of sealed up that cut. There it is on the back. I don't know if you can see it any clearer, but it the fabric is still nice and pliable, and it's washable. It will stay there. It won't wash out over time, so it takes care of those issues. It's also great if you sew on buttons. It seals the thread around the buttons so that you don't have, they won't kind of wear and cut off as easy. It'll last longer, and you know that your button will be nice and secure for a good long time. And here's an example of what I was talking about, where I just seal the starting and stopping points of my quilting. This block, I did a quilt as you go, so I quilted each block individually, and I just did it quick and dirty. I didn't want to tie in all of my ends, so I just trimmed them off, and I put a drop of Fray Check here. Whoops. And on this side, it's totally invisible. It dries nice and clear and soft, and it seals my thread so it's not going to come undone. So that's Fray Check and Sewer's Aide. They're both very, very useful for thread management. They're both by Dritz. One thing you will notice if you look closely, the bottles are almost identical. The Fray Check has a blue cap, Sewer's Aide has a white cap. Do not get them mixed up. If you put Fray Check on your thread, a couple things will happen. For one, you'll gum up your machine something fierce, and the other thing is it'll glue your threads together. So just don't do that. Keep them separate. Don't store them together on your shelf. Be very careful, and use them often, because you'll find that you come to rely on them. They will solve a lot of problems. While we're talking about thread management and just making thread easier to use, not everybody sews by machine all the time. There are still a lot of dedicated hand sewers, hand quilters out there, and Thread Magic, which is another silicone-based product, just gives you, it conditions your thread so it's a lot easier to use, and you'll really appreciate that too. Thread Magic comes in a cute little pot. You take the lid off, and then there are grooves around the outside of the pot, and you just place your thread on top, hold it, and run your thread through, and that conditions your thread by applying the product. And you can feel it right away. It makes your thread nice and slick and silky, very smooth, which helps with the needling through quilts. If you're going through a couple layers of fabric and batting and everything, you know, sometimes it's hard to needle. This makes it so much easier. Applique, so much easier when you've got the thread conditioned. It prevents your thread from untwisting, which often can happen when you're hand sewing. You're kind of twisting the thread as you sew, and it gets all tangled up. The other thing that's great is it makes it easier to thread your needle, because it seals those little raggy ends of your thread and keeps them together, which is much better than licking your thread, which is gross. The other thing about licking your thread, in these days of COVID, we don't want to do that, but even at the best of times, it swells the fibers of your thread, the moisture, so that it makes it even harder to thread your needle. So with silicone, there's no issue with your fibers swelling. It's easier to thread, easier to sew, perfect all around. So get yourself some Thread Magic.